We forgot about the Bay of Pigs invasion. However, the claim can be made that it set off the chain of events leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Moreover, its relevance has spiked after the US operation in Venezuela, which sparked new hopes for a US intervention to overthrow Cuba's government. Hello, my name is Ilarian, and today I will tell you the fascinating story of a failed CIA attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro's rule in Cuba in 1961, known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. In 1958, Cuba was a totally different country than it is now. Only 90 miles off the coast of Florida, Cuba was a continuation of the US economy, with many resorts, hotels, and casinos, many of them owned by the mafia. Cuba's economy was deeply interwoven, some even would say dependent on the US. For example, by the early 1950s, the United States government valued its investments in Cuba for approximately $750 million, nearly $10 billion in today's money. But from 1952, Cuba was ruled by Fulgencio Batista. He was a militaristic dictator supported by the United States. The United States was fine with him, but it all ended in January of 1959 with the Cuban Revolution that brought a new ruler to power, the notorious Fidel Castro. Castro's policies and rule led to the immigration of approximately 200,000 Cubans to the United States. This will be important later. Within 6 months, relations between America and Cuba had deteriorated because Castro took to confiscating large amounts of private property owned by wealthy US citizens and American companies. It didn't help that Castro created diplomatic and economic ties with the Soviet Union and started funding and supporting revolutionaries throughout Latin America. In June of 1960, the Congress passed legislation enabling President YT Eisenhower to take retaliatory action against Cuba. Eisenhower commanded the US forces in Europe during World War II and was no stranger to using force. Another important person to know was the legendary Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA from 1953 to 1961, who oversaw the Bay of Pigs invasion. First, Eisenhower cut off all sugar purchases from Cuba, equating to a massive portion of Cuba's exports. Needless to say, it caused financial problems, and soon after, the US banned all exports to Cuba except food and medicine. Diplomatic ties with Cuba were broken 8 months later in one of the last acts of Eisenhower's presidency. Simultaneously, the CIA had been planning an invasion of Cuba since May of 1960. The CIA planned to arm and train Cuban exiles that fled Castro's regime and had them start a revolution in Cuba. They named the exiles that were to work for the CIA Brigade 2506. The CIA trained them in Guatemala. Brigade 2506 would be deployed in Cuba and perform an insurrection. The CIA planned for Brigade 2506 to be then joined by local Cubans. The CIA thought that they could start and spearhead a revolution to overthrow Castro. Thus, the US wouldn't have to get directly involved in overthrowing a regime in another country, staging it as a local rebellion. Perhaps the greatest gamble was done when the CIA assumed that Cubans would rise against the government when they heard of a revolution starting. The CIA had its reasons, though, to believe that, because, for example, there were many rebellions, such as the Escambray Rebellion, which was a massive rebellion against Castro's rule in the Escambray Mountains of Cuba that lasted all the way to 1965. The plan was extensively debated internally with the newly elected president John F. Kennedy, who ultimately approved the plan. Kennedy did, though, change one thing. Instead of approving the previously chosen invasion site of Trinidad, he chose the Bay of Pigs. Now, when I was studying the Bay of Pigs in school, the name just appealed to me a lot. But it actually is the name of the bay in Cuba. It is called in Spanish Bahía de Cachinas, which directly translates as the Bay of Pigs. It turns out cochino also means both pig and triggerfish in Cuban Spanish, so it might be just a mistranslation. The operation itself started on April 15, 1961, when 3 US-made planes piloted by Cuban exiles bombed Cuban air bases. But they did minimal damage. 2 days later, Brigade 2506 landed in the Bay of Pigs, and from the start, everything started going wrong. The Bay of Pigs had coral reefs. Boats carrying the Cubans were damaged on these reefs. Some boats were even sunk. Air support was radically scaled back, a decision made by JFK, while the swampy terrain made the disembarking process extremely arduous. A delay Brigade 2506 could not afford when they were outnumbered 1,400 to 20 to 25,000. Standard military doctrine for naval landings usually requires superiority of the landing forces, air superiority, superior firepower, and an abundance of supplies, all of which can give an advantage to an invading army. None of these they had. Needless to say, the landing was doomed on these factors alone. While Brigade 2506 was still landing, they were spotted by the Cuban militia. They were able to capture several militiamen, but the militia unit was still able to raise the alarm. Castro now knew about the invasion, and his soldiers were coming before all troops had even landed. The plan for overthrowing Castro relied on a major revolt against Castro breaking out or large numbers of defections. This is contrary to what happened when very few Cubans actually joined the exiles who claimed to be liberating them. This is the proper time to use French saying, c'est plus qu'un crime, c'est une faute. This is worse than a crime, this is a blunder. The CIA incorrectly gambled that the population would come and join the local forces and that their invasion would be able to start a revolution. They got it wrong, it was a blunder, and it cost many lives in the end. Overwhelmed by the Cuban army on April 19th, Brigade 2506 surrendered to the Cuban army. The Cuban masses did not join the exiles, and in fact many were quite hostile to them. In total, Brigade's losses amounted to 114 men, 2 ships, and half of all the aircraft in their disposal. The Cuban army lost 176 men. The invasion force was defeated with more than 1,100 men captured in the aftermath. After being captured, the members of Brigade 2506 were crammed into trucks and taken to Havana, the capital of Cuba, where they were put on trial and most were given 30 years in prison. However, most were ransomed for $53 million in food and medicine between 1962 and July of 1965, being returned to the US soil, where they were met by the president and the first lady. The US government saw this as a massive failure. Richard Nixon was in DC at that time, actually, when the failed invasion started to appear in the papers, and he described the reactions of Allen Dulles and JFK. I don't know how well Nixon can be trusted as a source, but the information is interesting nevertheless. According to Nixon, Dulles said to him that day, quote, "The whole Cuban venture is a failure. Everything is lost. This is the worst day of my life." Dulles might have said that quite truthfully, as he resigned soon after the operation's failure, after heading the CIA for 9 years. Interestingly, Dulles blamed JFK's cancellation of 2 important airstrikes for the failure. Even more interestingly, Nixon describes how he then went to JFK. As Nixon says, Kennedy was quite outspoken in condemning all the people that advised him. The CIA, the military, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Then Nixon describes how JFK used a string of 4-letter words that he didn't learn in Harvard. In his anger, of course, Nixon, JFK's election opponent, can be biased to talk badly about Kennedy, but I think he highlights well how everyone blamed each other. Some accuse the CIA of giving faulty intelligence to the president, while others blame the failure of CIA's exclusion of anti-communist groups from the plan that were relatively strong anti-Castro fighters at that time. Others say that there was a problem with the spies that jeopardized the whole operation from the very beginning. In the end, it was a huge political fiasco for the United States. Even worse, as a result, Castro became, in the view of many, a victim of the United States' aggressive policy, fueling anti-US sentiments. The operation was a huge failure, especially due to the political damage done to US hegemony. Kennedy was seen by many, and especially by Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the USSR, as someone young and inexperienced. While there is no direct evidence of that, we can assume that a fiasco like that could have given Khrushchev a sign that he was facing off a weaker opponent. After Castro saw that the US was trying to overthrow him, he more openly and actively started seeking friendship with the USSR, and these factors likely paved the way for another event, only 18 months later, when Cuba became the center of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was arguably the closest point in history when we got to nuclear war. If there is one thing that we can learn from the Bay of Pigs fiasco, it is that even when the world's greatest powers and people undertake something, they can make mistakes, and that those mistakes should be prevented when possible, because the consequences of them can be huge. Thank you.